All right, let's jump right into Cybersecurity HQ's news update for December 9th, 2024. We've got a lot to cover today.
Yeah, no shortage of cyber attacks and vulnerabilities to dive into.
Seems like everything from medical device makers and global enterprises to critical infrastructure and AI is getting hit.
It really does highlight just how interconnected our digital world is.
Well, let's start with a vulnerability that I thought was particularly interesting. OpenWrt, the open source operating system that's often used in routers and a lot of IoT devices, they've disclosed a pretty serious security flaw.
Yeah, this is CVE 2024-54143. And it's a command injection vulnerability. What that means is that attackers could potentially compromise those firmware updates that a lot of people rely on.
So you're saying that even if someone's device checks that hash, they could still be tricked into installing that malicious firmware.
Exactly. Now, the good news here is that the official OpenWrt builds, those aren't affected.
That is good news.
Yeah. But this vulnerability is still a really big deal for, anyone who's building their own firmware or anyone who might be using unofficial sources.
Right.
And this really just underscores, those inherent risks in the software supply chain. And it doesn't matter if it's open source or closed source, these risks are everywhere. I mean, think about the SolarWinds attack from a few years back. That exploited that same trust within the software supply chain.
And look at the damage that caused. Okay. So moving on, it seems like ransomware just continues to be a major, major headache.
It really is. It's like a constant barrage of attacks. It's hitting pretty much every sector.
Yeah, it really feels like a rampage. I mean,
Yeah.
we've got Artivion, a U.S. medical device maker, struggling right now with operations that are disrupted. And who knows what kind of long-term financial impact they're going to be facing.
Right, it's hard to say at this point. And then there's Yonder. They're a supply chain software provider, but their clients include, huge companies, Starbucks, Morrison's.
So that's got to have ripple effects far beyond Blue Yonder.
Absolutely. When you hit this critical node in a supply chain, that disruption can cascade. And this attack was actually carried out by the Termite ransomware gang. They're really known for going after supply chains. It seems like they want to cause as much disruption as possible.
Yeah, maximum impact for sure. And then you've got Deloitte. They're facing their second ransomware claim in recent months. It's incredible.
I know. It really makes you realize that even these really well-resourced organizations, they can still be vulnerable.
No one is immune.
Nope. And then there's, the human cost of all of these attacks. Like, remember the Anna Jacques Hospital breach that happened back in 2023?
Yeah.
Money message. They got away with the data of over 316,000 individuals.
Medical records, financial details. It's scary.
And it's all out there now.
Devastating. And what gets me is that these ransomware groups, they're not slowing down at all. They're constantly changing their tactics.
I know, they're always adapting, coming up with new ways to get around security measures. Like, take Black Basta.
Right.
They're using email bombing to flood security filters. And there have even been reports of them using malicious QR codes.
Malicious QR codes. Wow.
I know, it's like, who would think of that?
It's just a reminder that these guys are always looking for new ways to exploit our trust and our familiarity with technology. Speaking of which, there's a lot of talk right now about vulnerabilities in specific devices and software.
For sure, Q&AP devices are a big one. At Tune to Own this year, some researchers managed to exploit some newly patched vulnerabilities in their systems.
Q&AP devices seem to be under attack a lot.
Yeah, they are. Network-attached storage devices, they're just a treasure trove of data for these guys. And then you have prompt injection attacks, these target large language models.
LLMs, as they're called. I've heard of those, but I don't really understand what they are.
Basically, they're these very powerful AI systems that can generate text, translate languages, write different kinds of creative content.
I see.
And the thing is, researchers have found vulnerabilities in some of these systems, like DeepSeek and Claude AI.
So does that mean that attackers could manipulate them to do things like take over accounts or even execute code?
That's right. It's a big concern. And it really highlights the need for developers to be extremely careful with LLMs.
It seems like every time AI gets more sophisticated, it creates more potential attack vectors.
It really is a double-edged sword. Then there's the SOC 5 Systems botnet. This thing is absolutely massive.
Yeah, over 85,000 compromised devices, they say. It's pretty alarming.
Yeah, and growing all the time. What's interesting is that BitSight, the security firm that's been tracking it, they traced the malware back to some pretty common loaders like SmokeLoader.
Loaders.
Yeah, basically they're designed to infect systems with all kinds of malicious software.
So this is a widespread threat.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that even devices that seem completely harmless can become part of this vast criminal network.
It's kind of scary when you think about it.
It is. And then there's the Ultralytics AI library compromise. That's a good example of a supply chain attack in action.
What happened there?
Hackers compromised 2 versions of their library on PyPI, the Python package repository.
So developers thought they were downloading a legitimate library, but it was actually malware.
Exactly.
Wow. And what about that breaking WAF vulnerability I keep hearing about?
Right. That one seems to have affected a lot of big companies. It basically exposed back-end servers to all sorts of attacks, DDoS, ransomware, you name it.
So even widely used security solutions can have flaws.
Yeah, and it shows how important proper configuration is. You can't just rely on a single solution to protect you. You need layered security.
Good advice. All right, let's move on to the geopolitical cyber landscape. Things are as turbulent as ever there, it seems.
Yeah. The EU is currently investigating TikTok. Seems that they're concerned about allegations of Russian election interference.
What happened there?
Well, the claim is that TikTok was used to spread disinformation during the recent presidential election in Romania.
That's definitely concerning.
Yeah, it really raises questions about platform responsibility. Social media can be a powerful tool for good, but it can also be weaponized for information warfare. And speaking of weaponization, Russia seems to be really stepping up their cyber game.
In what way?
There have been reports of them conducting tests of their so-called sovereign internet.
What is that exactly?
It's basically their attempt to create their own closed-off internet.
Doesn't that sound a lot like digital isolation?
That's exactly what it is. They want greater control over information flow. And there have also been suspected attacks targeting Ukraine's defense sector.
It's definitely a worrying trend. What about China? They're a major player in cyber espionage, right?
They are, and there's growing concern that they're shifting their focus to targeting U.S. critical infrastructure.
So power grids, transportation, communications, all that.
That's right. These systems are the foundation of our society.
So the potential for disruption is huge.
Yeah, and these activities are happening against a backdrop of, all this tension over Taiwan. It really highlights how cyber attacks are increasingly being used as a tool of statecraft.
It's a dangerous game.
It really is.
Now let's talk about AI. We've already seen how it can be a powerful tool for both good and bad when it comes to cybersecurity.
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword for sure. We're seeing the rise of AI-powered defense systems that can analyze massive amounts of data and detect threats much faster than humans ever could.
So AI is helping us stay ahead of the curve.
It is to a certain extent. But on the other hand, we're also seeing how generative AI is being used by criminals.
For things like phishing campaigns and developing malware.
Exactly. They're using it to automate attacks, create more convincing scams, you name it.
So the bad guys are just as quick to adopt these new technologies as the good guys are.
It's like an arms race.
Now,
And a recent report by Orange Cyber Defense warned that right now, offensive AI strategies are actually outpacing defensive capabilities.
that's a scary thought.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, before we move on to part 2 of today's news update, let's take a quick look at vulnerability prioritization.
That's becoming more and more important as the number of vulnerabilities keeps increasing and attack surfaces just keep expanding.
It's not just about patching every vulnerability that comes along anymore, is it?
Definitely not. You have to prioritize. You have to figure out which vulnerabilities pose the greatest risk and focus on those first.
And how do you do that?
You need to understand your assets, you need to know what their vulnerabilities are, and you need to have a good grasp on the potential impact if those vulnerabilities were exploited.
Sounds complicated.
It can be. And that's where technologies like AI and machine learning can help. They can analyze huge amounts of data to help you identify the highest priority threats.
So AI can help, but human expertise is still essential.
Absolutely. You need security analysts who can understand the data, interpret it, and make informed decisions about remediation. It's a partnership between humans and technology.
Right. It's becoming more and more critical as the threat landscape continues to evolve at such an unprecedented pace.
I agree. Organizations need to be proactive, they need to be adaptable, and they need to be constantly vigilant. The attackers are always looking for new ways in, so we have to stay one step ahead.
Well said. We'll dive deeper into some of these vulnerabilities and attack techniques in part 2 of our news update.
All right, welcome back to Cybersecurity HQ's news update. Ready to dive back in?
Definitely. Let's see what else is happening out there in the cybersecurity world. You mentioned earlier that no one's immune to these threats. And I see that even the world of sports and entertainment is feeling the heat.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it seems the Vegas Golden Knights, they're an NHL team, have partnered with Solus Security.
Interesting.
They're going to be their, like, official cybersecurity provider.
That's a pretty clear sign that cybersecurity is becoming, a top priority for all sorts of organizations.
Yeah, you don't really think of sports teams as being targets, but I guess they have a lot of valuable data, too.
Oh, for sure, they do. And as as cyber threats get more and more sophisticated, organizations are realizing that cybersecurity, it's really not optional anymore.
Yeah, makes sense. So what exactly does this partnership involve? What's Solus going to be doing for the Golden Knights?
Well, they're going to be providing a whole range of cybersecurity services. Think, advanced threat protection, incident response, security awareness training, the whole nine yards.
So they're really covering all their bases.
Yeah.
And they're not just protecting the team itself, right?
Yeah.
I read that it covers other parts of the Foley Entertainment Group, too.
You're right, it does. They're taking a pretty holistic approach to protecting all their digital assets.
And I see they're also planning to do some things to raise cybersecurity awareness among their fans, too.
Yeah, that's a great idea. They're going to be doing some promotions at games, social media campaigns. I think they're really trying to leverage their platform to educate a wider audience about cybersecurity.
I like it. It's great to see cybersecurity taking center stage in unexpected places like the world of sports and entertainment.
Uh-huh.
Okay, shifting gears a bit. There's this idea out there that macOS is more secure than Windows.
Right.
But recent reports are suggesting that macOS is actually becoming more of a target for malware these days.
Yeah, I mean, that whole idea that macOS is inherently more secure, it's kind of a misconception.
So it's not a magic bullet.
No, not at all. It's definitely been less targeted historically, but that doesn't mean it's immune. There's this new malware campaign that researchers are calling OS X Chainbreaker, and it specifically targets macOS users.
So what's so concerning about this OS X Chainbreaker campaign? What makes it different?
Well, it's using some pretty advanced tactics. It's actually using AI-generated content for phishing attacks, and it's spreading through these fake video meeting apps that people are downloading.
So they're really taking advantage of, current trends and people's familiarity with these types of apps.
Exactly. And it really just highlights how sophisticated these attackers are getting, how they're able to use things like AI to their advantage.
So what can macOS users do to protect themselves?
The same advice always applies, really. Use good antivirus software. Be careful about what you download and what links you click on. Always double check the source of software before you install it. Common sense stuff, but it really does make a difference.
Absolutely. Moving on, the FBI has issued a warning about potential vulnerabilities in the SMS systems that major telecom providers use. Have you heard anything about this?
I have. It sounds like Chinese hackers have infiltrated some of those SMS systems.
Really?
Yeah. It's a pretty big deal because it highlights how vulnerable our communication infrastructure really is.
So even something like SMS, which we think of as being pretty basic, can be compromised.
That's right. If you're sending sensitive information, it's always best to use an encrypted messaging app, something like Signal or WhatsApp.
Good to know. Okay, let's shift gears a bit and look ahead to the future. What are some of the big cybersecurity trends and predictions for 2025?
Well, AI is going to continue to play a huge role. We're going to see even more sophisticated AI-powered defense systems.
So AI can be a good guy.
Absolutely. But we're also going to see AI being used more and more by attackers. It's going to be this ongoing arms race.
So both sides are up in their game. What else should we be looking out for?
Quantum computing is another big one.
Yep.
As that technology matures, it's going to pose a serious threat to current encryption methods.
And what about things like cloud security and the cybersecurity workforce? Any predictions there?
Cloud security is going to continue to be a top concern, especially as more organizations move to multi-cloud environments. And the cybersecurity skills gap, that's going to remain a major challenge. There just aren't enough skilled professionals to meet the growing demand.
Right. Okay. Let's get back to some specific attacks and incidents. It looks like there have been some troubling developments in Romania.
Yeah, Electrica Group, they're the country's biggest electricity distributor. They confirmed they're dealing with a cyber attack right now.
So critical infrastructure is being targeted.
It seems so. And this comes after those suspected Russian cyber attacks against Ukraine's defense sector. Makes you realize that state-sponsored cyber warfare is a real and growing threat.
It's a scary thought. What about ransomware? Any notable attacks lately?
A couple in Japan, Kurita Water Industries, and Ito N, they were both hit. And then there's Artivion, a U.S. medical device maker. They were hit with ransomware right before the Thanksgiving holiday.
Talk about bad timing.
It really highlights how no organization is immune to these threats. Big, small, it doesn't matter.
I see. There have also been some interesting developments in the political sphere related to cybersecurity.
We're talking about Brian Harrell.
Yeah. He was an assistant secretary at the Department of Homeland Security. It seems like he's being considered for a top cybersecurity position in the next Trump administration.
It'll be interesting to see what happens there. And then there's Russia's move towards digital isolation.
With that whole sovereign internet.
Right. That's definitely something to keep an eye on. It raises a lot of questions about internet freedom and censorship. Speaking of specific vulnerabilities, a critical one was just patched in IBM's DB2 database software.
How serious was it?
It could have allowed attackers to launch denial-of-service attacks. IBM's released patches, so it's important for organizations to update their systems as soon as possible.
Good advice. What else is happening in the world of vulnerabilities?
ClickSense Enterprise for Windows has a critical flaw that could allow for remote code execution. That's a big one, so organizations using that software need to patch their systems right away. And then there's some fascinating research about how employee behavior can actually increase the risk of malware infection.
Oh, really? Tell me more about that.
A study by Trend Micro and a few universities found that people who visit certain types of websites, like adult sites or gambling sites, are more likely to encounter malware.
Interesting. So it's not just about clicking on suspicious links. It's also about being mindful of the websites you visit.
Exactly. User education is more important than ever.
For sure. What's the latest on zero-day attacks?
Palo Alto Networks has issued a warning about an actively exploited zero-day vulnerability in their NGFW interfaces. So that's something organizations need to address immediately.
That sounds serious. Any good news out there?
Actually, yeah. Montana State University is doing some really great work in cyber defense research. They're tackling all sorts of challenges like vulnerabilities in critical infrastructure and state-sponsored attacks.
And it looks like Kaspersky just released their IT security economics report. What are they saying?
Cybersecurity budgets are on the rise. Global enterprises are spending more and more to try to combat the rising cost of cyber incidents.
So companies are finally starting to take cybersecurity seriously.
It seems that way. And then you have these cyber criminals who are exploiting major events for their own gain.
Yeah,
Well, for example, during the Olympics, there are all these fake domains popping up trying to steal people's login credentials.
sneaky.
And the Mari ransomware group has been targeting a vulnerability in Apache ActiveMQ to install coin miners and backdoors on systems.
It's amazing how resourceful these criminals are. Any other news from the open source community?
Yeah, Google just released a new open source tool called Yonder. It's designed to help streamline Android security patch management.
That sounds useful.
Yeah, it should help make sure that Android devices are properly patched and protected. And then there's the Termite ransomware group. We talked about them earlier. They targeted Yonder, a major supply chain provider.
And that had some pretty big consequences for companies like Starbucks and Morrison's, right?
Yeah, it really highlighted how vulnerable supply chains are.
It's all connected.
It is. And then there's this new red team tool that's making the rounds called Combo C2.
What's that one all about?
It uses Microsoft Teams to execute commands on compromised systems. It's a pretty clever way to fly under the radar.
So even our collaboration tools can be weaponized.
That's right. On a more positive note, there's VetsInTech.
What's that?
They're a nonprofit that's been training veterans and their spouses in cybersecurity. They've trained over 2,000 people so far.
That's awesome. It's great to see initiatives like that addressing the cybersecurity skills gap and helping veterans find new careers. Speaking of which, I think it's a good time to touch on vulnerability prioritization again.
You're right. It's more important than ever.
Especially with all these new vulnerabilities popping up all the time.
Exactly. And the Verizon 2024 DBIR report really drives that point home. They found a huge increase in breaches that were caused by vulnerability exploitation.
So what's the key takeaway there?
Organizations really need to have accurate asset inventories. They need to be using things like software bill of materials, and they need to have a good understanding of their software supply chain risks.
It all comes back to knowing what you have and where your weaknesses are.
Absolutely. AI can help with prioritization, but human expertise is still essential.
Right. It's a team effort. Now let's talk about China again. There are growing concerns about their cyber espionage activities, right?
There are. It seems like they're shifting their focus to targeting U.S. critical infrastructure.
Things like power grids and transportation systems.
Exactly. If those systems were disrupted, it could have a huge impact on the country.
And in the pharmaceutical industry, the Akira ransomware group has been very active.
Yeah, they just stole 70 gigabytes of data from Cipla, a major pharmaceutical company in India.
Wow. What makes a Kira so dangerous?
They use a double extortion strategy. They encrypt data and then threaten to leak it if the ransom isn't paid. It puts a lot of pressure on organizations.
So what can organizations do to protect themselves from ransomware attacks?
It's all about having good defenses, endpoint protection, data backups, employee training. And before we wrap up this part of our news update, let's make a quick look at what's been happening with vulnerability prioritization. The Verizon 2024 DBIR report found a big increase in breaches that were caused by vulnerability exploitation.
So we've covered a ton of ground in this deep dive into today's cybersecurity news.
Yeah, we have a lot to digest for sure.
But before we wrap things up completely, any final thoughts for our listeners?
Well, I think, the key takeaway from all of this is that staying informed is really half the battle.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power, right?
Exactly. The more you know about the threats out there, the better equipped you'll be to protect yourself.
Couldn't agree more. And that's really what Cybersecurity HQ is all about. It's about providing people with the knowledge and resources they need to navigate this increasingly complex threat landscape.
That's right. We're a community, over 70,000 strong at this point, and we're all dedicated to making the digital world a safer place.
That's right. We've got our job board, for anyone looking to build a career in cybersecurity. We've got in-depth reports, breaking news coverage, our weekly newsletter. I mean, there's really something for everyone.
And whether you're, a seasoned security professional or just starting out, we encourage you to join the community.
Stay informed.
Learn from each other.
And together, let's make the digital world a little bit safer.
I like it.
That's it for today's cybersecurity news update from Cybersecurity HQ. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. Stay vigilant out there.